Chapter 1110 was full of monumental occurrences, but none grander than the emergence of the Elder Planet's true form being revealed to the readers finally. So, sticking in line with our recent video, which was deep diving into the Gorosei inspirations and some speculations, let's kind of give a bit of a follow-up and a revisit into who we now know they truly are.
Right. And one thing that I think is extremely interesting that you pointed out to me before we jump in too deep is that when you zoom in, there does seem to be a differentiation between each Gorosei, and there being a different number in each's specific summoning circle when they appear on Egghead.
This was something I speculated and talked to you about for a while, because we see the 5 when Saturn emerges the first time, so that could be the 5 elders, it could just be his 5. And so when I saw these circles, I spent so much time zooming in, but you can't see there's a clear 4 and there's a 1 on the far end. And so perhaps this either alludes to maybe them joining at different times, being recruited all throughout the 800 years by Imu, or maybe that's like a ranking system of who's closest to Imu and all of that.
Right, just a straight hierarchy.
But if we're going to follow the numbers, we could pick out based on which yokai form emerged from each circle. 1 would be Jupiter, 2 would be Nusjuro, 3 would be Warcury, 4 would be Mars, and 5 would be Saturn.
And so, same as we did in our last Gorosei discussion, we're going to follow the same format and go from the closest to the sun outwards. So we'll begin with top man Warcury.
And his yokai form, as is told to us in the chapter as well, they really held nothing back. They kind of just pulled the curtain away.
They dumped it all at once. We got so much information in one panel.
And his would be the Hokei, which actually originates from Chinese mythology originally, and it is a symbol of wanton violence and greed, which first appeared during the time of Emperor Yao, who is one of the legendary 5 emperors. And it's just renowned essentially for sowing terror as it rampages across the land with its deadly tusks, which are not just only tusks.
Yeah. First, its appetite is, and I came across this word more than once when I was studying it, insatiable. It'll lay total waste to any land, devour livestock, and even people too slow to escape. And we definitely see that rampaging, and specifically his giant tusks in action, with the way that he's able to turn them in chapter 1111 into 2 swords when he charges at Luffy and the giants. And then also just with his gigantic roar of haki that he lets out that really reverberates across the whole island.
True, and that's a very unique feature we haven't seen with pretty much anybody else. These yokai forms are very unique, and perhaps it could just be a display of his haki, because we couldn't find any notable characteristics of the Hokei that tied back to a roar. But maybe that's just a sly way of Oda saying these were former conquerors that are now at the heel of Imu too.
Then on top of that, it has tough skin that's akin to metal. Like, that's crazy. And in at least the Chinese mythology, it roamed rampant until it was taken down by a legendary archer demigod, Hao Yi, which killed it with a giant arrow, which we could maybe compare to the arrow seen early in chapter 1110, shot by some of the giants.
It was interesting that they drew a separate panel in the midst of all of this occurring, just to highlight an arrow being shot at a ship.
Single arrow, and one that took out that entire ship.
Exactly, it exploded, and it shows the devastation.
And I also think it's important to keep in mind, because we see a whole plethora of abilities that it might not just be a single kind of mythology that it's inspired from. It might not just be the Chinese mythology. It could be something like the Mokas, which comes from Celtic mythology, which is a boar or a swine god, which is very commonly connected with the Roman god Mercury, who, of course, is the namesake for Warcury.
And you also came across another somewhat boar demon known as the Babu Nepe.
Exactly, and this was from Indonesian mythology, and this creature had a lot more lore tied to it, where it was believed to be a manifestation of a person practicing black magic with the end goal of becoming instantly rich. So in exchange, they had to sacrifice their humanity and take on the form of this demon boar. And a lot of the myths told that before they turned into it, they were in all black robes and then would perform a sort of ritual to transform into the creature and then roam the village and basically just come away with all of the goods and riches of the people of the village.
And, I mean, we've pretty much seen them all wearing essentially all black, minus Nusjuro being different again. But they're always wearing their black suits, akin to the black robes. It seems like if they were recruited, these people could easily be individuals who sold their humanity to attain this kind of power, so it's very fitting with the kind of concept at hand.
Exactly, and on top of that, the lore continues to say that the person practicing Babenepe would also need an assistance from another person who was tied back into the real world that, at least in the original mythology, would stand guard of a lit candle floating on a basin of water while they were in action stealing from the villagers. And if that flame began to shake or fade, it was a direct sign that the practitioner who was stealing from the people was now in danger.
And we speculated previously that with seeing how they can regenerate and recover so quickly, it's possible they're able to even pool all of their health and ability and endurance together, kind of acting as that candle bearer and watcher for one another. And now that they're all on the battlefield, maybe that has to be the role of Imu.
Exactly, and tying it specifically into the role that Warcury could play as the warrior god of justice, this entire story could just allude to the corrupt use of the royal justice system to specifically benefit the elites and Imu's throne. And along with all that, the way that we see the empty Nusjuro room, this could be setting up Imu's overwatch of them now back on Earth, similar to the assistance needed in the Indonesian mythology, where they need someone to keep watch on them, or just, keep tabs on them to make sure that they don't mess up or they're not taking advantage.
Well, somebody that they've definitely been keeping an eye on, as well as every reader in this chapter, would be our next planet in line, being Ethan Baron v. Nusjuro, and his yokai form being the Bakotsu. And this one is one that provided me a lot of frustration trying to do research into doing so, because a lot of what we can find about the Bakotsu is simply that it's a yokai of a horse that was burned to death in life, resulting in its current form as this massive skeletal horse being undead. And like I said, it's simply not something that's had a lot of its Eastern literature translated into English, and the articles you can find online are often referring to its scripture and scrolls that you can find in books like the Totsa Aboke Zoshi, which does not really give you a lot to speculate on. So instead, we figured we might as well speculate on what we were shown in the chapter.
And that ties in to the ice abilities that are very, very similar to Brook's undead ability to summon the freezing powers of the underworld through the force that's tethering him to the living world.
Which perhaps Nusjuro is simply using an awakened or an advanced form of that, perhaps being who he is and his ability to morph somewhat between a man and this undead horse. The undead horse could be of the undead rider or the headless horseman. There's so many undead lore tied to concepts of horses. It's just very difficult to find specific research on this particular yokai, so perhaps he is residing as the current king of hell of sorts, which not only ties him by powers in similarity to Brook, but puts him at odds with the title that Zoro has been self-proclaiming himself for ever since Wano.
Right, and it also just ties into the idea that Saturn spoke when he first came down of he hasn't touched the surface in a while. They really might have one foot in each reality of hell and earth. And that could be why he's able to both take on his demon form and still keep that top half more human-like while he's attacking.
And another interesting connection that I thought back on, considering there's not many times you see Brook and Zoro kind of brought together by an individual, but one time we do see it previously in the story would be in Thriller Bark with Ryuma, which kind of has an inverse parallel to the situation, although Ryuma did have Brook's shadow and some of his abilities and personality because of it. He was always one-upping Brook. So perhaps in terms of that, instead of swords play like Zoro was able to help him out with in the past, this time the undead being he has to fight, he has to actually take on in an entirely new form, including his ice forms, his undead, likely spiritual powers, and help Brook once again. Maybe they team up. That would be an awesome fight to watch the two of them work together.
I was gonna say, because even recently in Egghead, they were the two. After the crews had been separated and everyone else left with Lilith, they were the two that stayed back and watched the ship, because they both felt the need to stay back and keep an eye. And also they had a good bonding moment just between each other that I kind of enjoyed, both in the manga and the anime.
Yeah, they have a chance to actually continue building on that, so it would be interesting to explore that kind of dynamic that's not so much touched on in the crew. But we are going to have to continue to move on if we want to get to everybody, and the next one's a little hard to miss, as he probably had the most physical presence in the chapter, being St. Marcus Mars and the Itsumade, which is big bird.
Yeah, we kind of nailed it with our prediction of this one, but man, even so, still very, very impressive to see in its full demon form and just what it truly was capable of and how terrifying it came across.
Terrifying is a fantastic word for it, and the Itsumade, classified by the face of a human with a beak still, the body of a serpent, and the talons and wings of a bird. They kind of nailed the representation for sure, but not the crane we were predicting, of course, but the foul bird category we'll take another semi-win on our own books. But I did not see something like this coming, and terrifying, eerie plagues.
Nightmare fuel.
It is consistently referred to across every medium and story I can find as an eerie bird. Similarly, like you said, insatiable for that appetite, the word eerie very commonly came up when looking into the Itsumade, and there are some legends that this bird will even perch at the top peak of a town or village, and when it sings or screams, 50% of the village will get sick, which is why it's often associated with times of calamity and plague, which often come from famine and calamities to the environment, so it stays in line with Mars's role as well.
And one interesting fact about the Itsumade is that their diet is described literally as the lamentation of death. That's what they feed off of, as it was initially said to be summoned by the plague in the wake of the fall of 1344 in Japan. If he's in control of the environment and feeds on death in a similar manner, it's very possible that some of the more large-scale diseases and calamities to overtake entire nations could be directly tied into his actions.
And his desire to feed. I mean, think about the concept of Fleavance. It is a location whose generations slowly became more and more sick because of what the environment was doing to their body. And eventually, once they realized what was happening, instead of receiving help from the world government, who they were paying these taxes to, they were quarantined in and eradicated. It's almost as if they were set up like a feeding dish in a delicious meal for a yokai that feeds on that suffering and death, which is maybe what Mars does when he has a nation like that come across. Maybe that's exactly what it's for, which is dark to think about, but these are some pretty dark creatures, and it's only gonna get a little bit weirder as we can continue to go on, because Saint Shepherd Jupiter is probably the odd one out in considering most other people being the Sandworm.
Yeah, in a few different ways, he really sticks out as unique. I mean, first there's the rest of them having a very specific kanji, and then him just Sandworm. You know, more English translation, no real direct mythology ties. Once we looked into it a bit more, there were some references to more of a limbless serpentine dragon from Old Norse and European mythology. Early on there was some wings associated, but the vast majority, especially more modern, they were wingless, either legless or very small legs, and sometimes even more sea-based. And their overarching common traits were that they guarded treasure and personal territory, and sometimes were known to breathe fire and or poison.
Which is just insane to think about. We've already seen Saturn using poison, but as soon as I saw that they breathed fire, that's just... it's very dragon-like.
Yeah, and they can do it from coming up underneath you. They can burrow right under you and then just...
Which makes it pretty in line with their role to guard treasure, and one thing we know for a fact is Marijois does have a very in particular treasure that Doflamingo referenced himself in his blackmail, so perhaps that's even an in particular role for him considering the form he's taken. But it could also be a reference to something that we've seen in more recent media like Dune, where the Sandworms, which were based on dragons that lived under the sand and are attracted to vibrations, are very territorial, and I can only imagine Jupiter going under the ground and burrowing like he does in this chapter. If he's feeding off of vibrations, it's pretty easy to track down the drums of liberations that Joy Boy is giving off.
And while Mars, before him, as we just mentioned, seems more focused on spreading disease and pain to other regions and taking their power, from other lands, there's a good chance that Jupiter, as agriculture, is more rooted in maintaining the power and kingdom that they already have, sowing the seeds of what already is under their control and giving it more substantiality in the world.
Absolutely, and since you mentioned it before, why don't we talk about the very last of our elder planets, the one we've definitely known the most about so far, that being St. J. Garcia Saturn, the Gyuki, or the Ushi-Oni, the ox spider, whatever you want to call it, but wherever you want to look, there's a number of different stories and lore and mythology, just really depending on what region you're from or what culture you are being told. However, as we've seen, they do have a affinity and a history of utilizing poison and creating diseases similar to what we've seen with the poison Saturn's using on his legs, and the diseases he used just to toy with Ginny and Bonnie.
And we also see in chapter 1111, he shows a new poison ability where he spits those balls of poison at Dory, Broggy, and Luffy.
Yeah, and that was a little more directly tied to the powers of the Ushi-Oni that's been kind of referenced in mythology.
Another interesting fact that I did come across in a lot of those lore is that it's not uncommon for them to be a yokai that will actually cooperate with other yokai when hunting or trapping additional victims, often if they seem like they can't really do so on their own. So it's not really surprising to me that he was the kind of yokai that they used to kind of tie in everyone else to this central point.
And I'll just add in, that could also feed into the thought that we've had over the course of this arc, especially recently, that he could be the first domino to fall in the Gorosei chain, because he kind of seems like someone that they would use almost to their advantage as a more dependent individual.
I mean, it would make sense also if he was the fifth one recruited, the last one in. He likely is the most expendable, considering they didn't have him all those years before. So if he were the first one to fall, it wouldn't also feel like they're totally toppling everything else the world government might represent in the final saga. However, since the lore of the Gyuki is so varied and doesn't really have a notable overarching theme to talk about, it would make sense that he kind of ends it here. You think about it, everyone he's kind of most connected to and hurt the most, between Kuma and Kizaru and Vegapunk, and now he's got all of his supporters here. If he's going to lose, everything's kind of on the table for him already, so it would make sense for his character.
Right, and all of the other things that the other four Gorosei oversee are something that seems more fundamental to holding up a society, whereas, science and creation, that's more added bonus. So he's almost just kind of
a luxury Gorosei.
Yeah, where if we had to get rid of one thing, it would be our extra amenities.
That makes sense, and if you do think about it, if they were ordered in when they were recruited, you look at it first where control their agriculture with Jupiter, control their food, pretty easy control. Move over to finance, and if you control the way the money moves, you control a lot of what happens in the world. Moving on to justice, if you make the laws, you pretty much are justice yourself, alluding to the Doflamingo speech. 4, like you said, moving into environment, if they are controlling what is the chaos of this One Piece world environment, then that's a lot of power in its own regard.
And with the Void Century, it seems to be innovation and scientific advancement that threatened them in the first place.
And that's possibly why they brought Saturn in. Maybe it was the Iron Giant attack. Maybe it was another piece of ancient kingdom tech we don't even know about. But something made them feel unsafe and insecure enough they needed it at the time. But perhaps they don't feel that way if they have the Mother Frame, or the Mother Flame as it's sometimes called. Perhaps they don't see it as so much as a necessity anymore.
Especially with how he's been handling the current situation.
And so, with all of that in mind, we wanted to kind of point out a little motif that Abe actually noticed in his research that feels like it's a good way to summarize each of their new forms we know more about.
Right, so in Chinese culture, there is kind of an overarching 5 domesticated traditional animals recognized throughout their society. So first, there's the horse, which obviously is directly tied to Venus Juro. There's cattle, which we can tie to the cow-bull connection with Saturn. Then, technically considered a rooster, you could also widen out to fowl, which is obviously Mars in his bird form. Then there's the pig, which obviously is the boar Warcury. And that leaves the sheep, which we technically don't have, with Jupiter being a worm, but his name is quite literally shepherd. And I mean, that's a pretty direct homage that I can see. And it really just feels like these could be all tied into Emu's greater role for all of them.
Absolutely, and he has in a way also domesticated each of these great and powerful things, so
to bow to him.
It could be a way of just alluding to the power he holds if he should be the one to grant it to him. So with that all in mind, whatever the future of the story may be, it's clear to us that these characters are immense in every single way, from their names to the forms that they've taken to now some of the most intimidating character designs we've received in the story, and even some creatures we don't know that much about from Eastern lore yet. There's so much to be understood and learned about, but for now, I think that we're just gonna have to wait and watch.
Yeah, and so we're gonna leave you all with one final overarching question, and that's, how do you think the Gorosei's powers actually work? Are they individual devil forms that maybe are the original spawn of devil fruits? Could they be something that Emu strategically chose? Could they be even something that he directly created or bestowed upon them personally from his own power? And on top of that, just tell us which one of these 5 is your personal favorite, at least to this point, and what you expect out of them.
And with all of that in mind, make sure you guys like, subscribe if you want to hear more content like this, and as always, be crew.